Today we're talking to Jed Steele, Chief Operating Officer of international fashion retailer Forever New. Jed began his career in his native South Africa before moving to Australia. Jed, welcome and thank you for taking the time to talk to us today.
Morning, Beverly. It's good to see you. Thank you for the opportunity.
So let's leap straight in there. You started your career a wee while ago, back in your native South Africa. So can you just tell me, how did you get into the whole merchandise planning thing and into retail, and where did you start?
So in South Africa, we followed a typical UK graduate recruitment management development program type of way of graduates getting into retail. So when you were, at university and you'd be in your third year of either commerce or arts or social sciences or whatever it was, you would generally have meetings with prospective employers, people who might be looking for entry into accounting firms or entry into retailers or entry into fast-moving consumer goods. And they would literally pitch at the universities what their management development programs would look like. And I went to one of those and got attracted by retail. I'd been working for a retailer as a casual job all the time that I was at university, and knew that it was quite prestigious in South Africa, as it was in the UK, to be selected by a retailer to enter into a very formal program where you didn't really even have a clue as to what discipline you would follow, but you just knew that you liked the merchant element of retail, and that retail offered a really good career perspective.
So whilst you're doing that, is that when this whole sort of merchandise planning thing sort of gripped you?
It did. Initially, I went in actually as a store retail development candidate. I was working in for Woolworths in South Africa, which is very similar to Marks and Spencer's. At the time, had a part ownership, but it was a typical department store renowned for its development program. And you entered. You had to do almost 9 months of a very formalized process of moving through every department in the store. And once you had passed that, you would go through being a department manager to a floor manager, a foods manager, or a textiles manager. And within that process of doing all of that, that I actually met a whole lot of merchandise planners when they were doing their store visits. And that created the attraction going, well, the parts of the job that I love are the parts that they're doing. And particularly when I got to the food division of Woolworths, I realized that where you were in control of the ordering was the part that I really liked, and thought, well, that's the career I want to follow. So approached them to see if I could actually do a switch into head office, and bang, the merchandise planning career kicked off.
So what we see in the industry is that merchandise planning in South Africa is really highly regarded, and a lot of companies recruit from South Africa to get merchandise planning people over here. Why is merchandise planning so strong in South Africa?
I think it came from the period of isolation. So during the apartheid era, South Africa was cut off from other retailers and international retailers setting up in the country. So the retailers that were home-based needed to be as good as the retailers they were trying to mimic, or the retailers that they were connected to in if you call it the free world. So the talent needed to be homegrown as opposed to imported. The whole process of creating the framework, the whole process of range building, and the entire process of product development were skills that had to be homegrown. And South Africa was in the really fortunate position of being in a country with textile mills, had a fantastic textile manufacturing base, had a good footwear manufacturing base. So largely, even in isolation, the country was able to survive without having to import goods from any other country. But it had to be from the inception of the merchandise plan right through to the exit, all needed to be done in isolation without actually looking to the outer world. So that the ownership structures where you could actually insights into some other countries as to how they did it, and particularly the UK. That became really important in terms of what did a management program look like, what were the tools that were required. Largely this was all before computers and all before spreadsheets really came about. This was all about doing it in blue books with pen, paper, ruler, and erasers, but the ABC of merchandise planning hasn't changed. It's just progressed and it's become enabled by technology. But the basics were put in place. And then I think South Africa decided to invest in it because retail was a particularly strong sector. And we had a really good education system in South Africa. We had a really good university system in South Africa. And whilst it produced good results in the area of retail, it also did in the big major accounting firms and consultancies. And retail had to stand up to the competition of how do you attract the graduates into those roles. And then once South Africa actually came out of the isolation, sort of in the early 90s, that talent then became open to the rest of the world to actually pick away at the talent that was there. And there were countries that hadn't invested as strongly as the UK had and South Africa had in those programs, and largely the States, New Zealand, certainly Australia, they saw South Africa as a pool of talent where they could actually fill in the gaps where there were gaps in the Australian market or in their markets. And South Africa probably had such a depth of talent, and equally with the way that living in isolation had created that opportunity that people were looking to also move away. So it became a bit of a win-win situation that you could actually move on in your chosen career with a really full toolkit of the training and the development that you needed, and put it into a company offshore.
Yeah, it's interesting, Jed, because I started my career with Marks and Spencer in a similar 18-month program that you got the opportunity, a lot of formal training, a lot of opportunity to experience different parts of the business. But I was very focused, because I come from the fashion degree, that I was very focused. I wanted to work in apparel and I wanted to be in the buying stream. But I think that whole thing of having this very formalized training program really sets you in good stead for everything that you do. It's like really strong foundations, isn't it?
Yes, it is. As part of it, you had to complete the human resource component, you had to complete the merchandising, the visual merchandising component, you had to spend time as a trainee buyer, even though you didn't want to be a buyer, you wanted to be a planner, but you got to learn what that side of it looked like. There was time spent with design, time spent with store development, with IT. So you really got in that first 9-month period, you got this broad look at the business. And whilst you were having a good look at the business, they were having a good look at you to go, well, we think this person's one personality, one analytical brain, your left brain or your right brain, what's the best stream for this person to follow? And for me, I was determined to follow the in-store retail stream, and I came out of the back end of it with a merchandise planning future.
So I'm going to move on now and talk about, your current role and Forever New. And what really interests me is, for the business, you're in how many markets?
16.
16 markets.
Yeah.
So how do you merchandise plan for 16 markets? Because I'm assuming that there are some great differences in terms of the kind of product that sells in one market that doesn't really sell in another market. So how do you go about that?
It's difficult and it's complex. It's added a level of complexity that probably I haven't seen in any other business. So we essentially try and start with a Southern Hemisphere range, concurrently starting with a Northern Hemisphere range. So there are 2 range builds that start at the outset. We do set the framework for every territory or every country independently right up front. So we would start with a channel view of what the Middle East would look like, or what the UK and Europe would look like, or Canada, or Singapore, New Zealand, South Africa, India. And we'd build those merchandise plans out. Then essentially we begin to roll those together and we start to range plan Northern Hemisphere first because it's on the longer lead time. So those sign-offs always happen ahead of Southern Hemisphere, but they also need to happen ahead of Southern Hemisphere. From a trend perspective, the notion of taking a Southern Hemisphere brand and sending it to the Northern Hemisphere in a following mode just doesn't hold water. It needs to be exactly the opposite way around. So that Northern Hemisphere range always leads. And you then end up with two ranges that you've built. And then we get to a process where we say we've got the Middle East, which has got a slightly different handwriting. It's more formal, slightly more conservative. It's more dress focused. It's it generates a better average retail price than other markets. And areas like Singapore, where you've got a 10-month summer, and because you've built two independent ranges, you are able to piece together ranges that suit each country. So we might have elements of the Northern Hemisphere range with other elements of the Southern Hemisphere range to make the perfect Singapore range. And in the Middle East, we take the best of both because we're always looking for sleeve coverage, always looking for more of a dress range that either the Southern Hemisphere or the Northern Hemisphere would have.
Are there colors that work in one market that just never work in another market, or are there things that, like, for you really stand out and say, oh, we'd never send that to wherever?
There are some things, probably around dress length. So there's different body shapes in different parts of the world. So you need to be quite careful with the mix of, say, a shorter mini skirt in the South African market, just larger body shaped women in that part of the world, and we generally do better with pencils or with middies. But then they'd be really brave with what happens with off the shoulder or with necklines, whereas in the Middle East it's all about the neckline and actually ensuring that that's correct. So all those get picked up in the SWOT process. So we would conduct a post-season review for each market on a quarterly basis, track all the learnings that we have on a quarter-by-quarter basis, and then we pull those out during the range build process just to remind ourselves what it is that different markets like. There's definitely markets that prefer print to plains, and there are markets that you will get a better price for a print and something which they identify as a Forever New looking print with the Forever New handwriting, compared to a colored jersey product, which may be covered sufficiently by other retailers within that market. Whereas in Australia, it would be a higher mix of our business, but in a country like India, would be a lower part of our business because it's so well covered by other internationals or by the department stores that are there.
That's really interesting. I always remember when I first came to Australia being surprised how much black was worn, particularly in Melbourne, whereas I know in the UK, navy is the color of spring. If you always put navy in spring because everybody sort of really gravitates towards navy, and you can't go wrong with navy, white and red. Navy and white is just, if you've got to have that in your range, and it's those sort of differences I find really interesting.
Yeah, and you see that on regional differences. So Melbourne sells a far stronger percentage of black to any other city in Australia. New Zealand typically does as well because of the rugby and the all black notion that goes along with that. But when you get to areas like Perth and Queensland, those two regions are light color quite a lot more. And we also have to identify within Australia that we have hot zones and cold zones. So on a quarterly basis, there are at least 2 quarters of each year that are impacted by a hot store strategy versus a cold store strategy. And we might decide that Perth changes at the end of March, but Queensland only changes to being a cool store at the end of April. So that ranging and that range building needs to be brought into it as well. And that complexity, we spend more time doing it for Australia because it's the home market and it's the highest profit generating market for us. But the principles of it apply equally to other parts of the world.